Today's episode is dedicated to the recent NATO summit to discuss potential outcomes for Ukraine as well as the ongoing Russian invasion. What discussions took place behind closed doors? What is the Western perspective on Ukrainian victory? That still is perhaps not as clearly defined as it should be. And of course, Ukraine's role at this year's NATO summit seems to have been downgraded compared to last year's. Is there now a risk that countries like the US may normalize relations with the pariah terror state Russia, even though other NATO members in Europe are resisting that? Well, I'm going to be discussing these topics with Mark Temnycky, who is a Ukrainian American freelance journalist. He's based outside of New York City and is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He has covered not just the war, but NATO and various other geopolitical topics for a whole range of different publications and organizations as well, including Daily Mail, Forbes, Kyiv Post, EUobserver, the Atlantic Council, Wilson Center, and many, many others. Mark, welcome back.
Thank you again for having me. Can I be a bit of a pain since we're recording?
Be a
Uh,
complete pain and amend
Thank
anything
you.
you need to in that introduction.
Okay, Temnycky.
Temnitsky.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. Other than that, everything was fantastic.
Everything's
So,
perfect. Apart from getting your
yeah,
name,
yeah,
apart from completely
yeah.
mangling your name, everything is fine. Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm sorry I'm not bringing it up sooner. But
No,
yeah,
no.
other than that, we're good. So I apologize for
I
making
think
that.
in our last conversation, I may have checked before with you before we started recording. But there we go.
Yeah, that's okay.
I fell into the spelling trap there. Um, well, let's talk about the NATO summit because a lot was discussed, but it seemed to become, in some ways, the Trump show. In that, whatever leaders wanted to do, they had to sort of moderate it somewhat to fit in with not just Trump's agenda, but also, dare I say it, his personality.
And a lot of news outlets are reporting on that as well. And there's some understanding why this would occur. For example, the United States has a very large economy and very strong defense capabilities. So I think that the Europeans are realizing more and more as the Russian invasion of Ukraine is occurring and the significance of events unfolding, the Europeans understand that they need to have a stronger collective security. In addition, when he was former President Trump running for the campaign in 2024 for president of the United States, President Trump continuously said that the United States is a police force, it's doing too much internationally, it needs to scale back on its involvement. And when he was elected and now president for a second term, he has repeated a lot of these points. And I think a lot of European officials are concerned about, especially with some previous statements made. Who knows how accurate they are? But when he was in his first term from 2016 to 2020, there were additional criticisms he made about NATO and about it being an outdated organization, how there were perhaps concerns that the United States was going to withdraw from NATO. And as President Trump continues these points about more and more members of the alliance need to contribute more, I think this finally woke up several European countries as well as Canada, realizing, okay, perhaps this is a very serious concern. The collective needs to do more if the United States seriously is going to scale back. And as a result, what can the alliance do to tailor to Trump's comments and thought processes so that the United States will continue being a member of the organization and upholding the organization rather than it withdrawing, and then that leaves a large vacuum, as some people would say, for this organization.
So where are we? Because as you say, previously Trump, in his very transactional mindset, seems to have been extremely hostile to the idea of collective defense, to the idea of all of this upfront investment for something which is not that tangible, let's say, in the short term. Um, is the US in, out? Is it ambivalent? What has Europe, dare I say it, sacrificed to keep the US on board?
Several outlets are reporting that the recent NATO summit was a victory for President Trump, something that he was advocating coming into the organization, as he was saying that NATO countries have to do burden sharing. For those unfamiliar with the term, that means that rather than the United States doing a lot of the management and the creation of equipment, it would be scattered throughout the European and Canadian members, where they would also invest heavily in defense industrial base, different types of weapon technology, so that each country is responsible or can play to their strengths rather than the United States playing to a lot of these areas. So that was one of the items that came from the NATO declaration saying that the NATO members put a larger emphasis on this quote unquote burden sharing. An additional thing that President Trump was stating coming into the summit was the need for several NATO members to increase defense spending, and in some capacity, this is a serious point. When the NATO members met in 2014, they created the 2% threshold of gross domestic product being spent on defense capabilities. And that was in 2014 with the goal that all of the members at the time were going to reach that 2% target because it was agreed upon by all the members. By 2021, only 6 of the NATO members had reached that point within 7 years. And that was a criticism back then by President Trump, how when he was ending his term, he continuously said that the United States is doing too much. Other members of NATO need to do more. I believe that with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian forces, this has shown the Europeans the importance of collective security and national security. This even saw Finland and Sweden, 2 countries that have been historically neutral for several decades, become part of the alliance. And as a result, by this calendar year, 2025, now 23 of the 32 members of NATO meet that 2% defense threshold. But while there has been a large emphasis in defense spending, there are still 9 countries within NATO who have not met the 2% target. And now all NATO members have agreed that they're going to increase that 2% threshold to a 5% threshold of GDP. And the goal is to reach this target by 2035. And in 2029, they're going to do evaluations about where are countries progressing with defense capabilities, how much are they spending on GDP. To date, Poland, of the 32 members of NATO, is the only country that is very close to the 5% target. It's, I think, 4.5% currently. And something that is a concern for several members, such as Spain. Spain has not even reached the 2% threshold, and they openly said during the summit that we have not met the 2%. How can we meet the 5% ability? So something that the current Secretary General Mark Rutte of the Netherlands has said is they're going to break down the 5% GDP in 2 categories. So the first category is 3.5%, and that would be traditionally what people think about defense spending, about weapons, equipment, other capabilities that they would use. The second portion of the 5% is 1.5%, which is including infrastructure necessary to hold weapons or equipment, cybersecurity capabilities. Something that they even included is for countries who are providing defense equipment and capabilities to Ukraine, that counts towards the 5% GDP threshold. And I think that's a very important point because now that intertwines Ukraine's collective security with NATO's collective security. So while Ukraine has not formally been invited to become a NATO member, the fact that NATO security is coexisting with Ukrainian security and that defense capabilities sent to Ukraine also counts towards that 5% threshold that the 32 members need to meet, I think is very significant.
And of course, 5% or 3.5%, which is the more actual figure, it's being talked about in the media, but those who perhaps are more, let's say, closer to the issues of defense, and of course, those who are following the evolution of warfare in the context of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, will point out that 3.5% is kind of neither here nor there unless it's tied to strategic goals and unless it's tied to some kind of reform or recognition that warfare has fundamentally changed, that procurement supply chains have changed, that these large, expensive platforms, like the one that Germany's just announced, the sort of, huge investment potentially in armored vehicles and Leopard 2s, to some extent, unless you combine that with highly innovative drone warfare, this 3.5% may count for almost nothing unless it is spent, let's say, wisely.
And 3.5% per the 32 members is very different, right? So 3.5% for a country such as Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania countries that have roughly 4 million individuals for their population is very different than a country such as the United States, which has 330 million, and the economy is significantly larger. So it's interesting to see what is that obsession with that specific financial number and the abilities. And as discussed too, like as you were stating, how is the 3.5% being used? Is it to simply meet the target, or are the finances being used well and in ability, so it's allowing countries to become stronger and promoting national defense and security? And that was also an issue that came up during the NATO summit, is when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022. The declaration made after the 2022, 2023, and 2024 NATO summits were very clear about how Russian aggression has to be stopped, how the alliance is going to continue providing assistance to Ukraine, that the alliance needs to establish stronger and more meaningful national security and defense capabilities with a strategy on how to adjust not only just Russian aggression, but the European collective as a whole, and Canada and the United States, about what does national security mean? What does collective defense mean? And the BBC, as well as some other news outlets, the week leading up to the NATO summit, stated that because of how the political climate is changing within the United States, the topic of a national security strategy specifically toward Russia was removed from the agenda.
That's interesting, isn't it? And I think there were 42 mentions of Russia, including placing clear and unequivocal emphasis on Russia being the peer adversary, the main priority in terms of NATO's focus. All that language, all that focus was taken out this year, but also something significant, and that was Ukraine was front and center in terms of support in many of the sessions and focus of the agenda last year. Russia was front and center as an adversary. This year, Ukraine, its role, one could say, was significantly downgraded in this NATO summit.
Yes, when the full-scale invasion began in 2022, the declaration made at the summit was very clear how the alliance was going to provide defense equipment and assistance to Ukraine, and it very much condemned the Russian aggression and that Russian aggression needs to be stopped. It then built on those points in 2023 by establishing the NATO Ukraine Council, which is a body that discusses NATO Ukraine relations, what Ukraine needs to do in terms of political changes, defense capabilities, also speaking and establishing a stronger relationship, which was very significant because no other aspiring member of NATO has something similar like the Council has with Ukraine. In addition, in 2023, NATO said that Ukraine does not need to fulfill no longer a membership action plan, which is very significant because for some countries previously aspiring to become part of the alliance, this was seen as sometimes as a holdup because there were no specific target dates or how things would be implemented in terms of being part of it. And then last year during the summit, NATO announced that it would open a institution within Ukraine where a senior NATO official would meet regularly with Ukrainian officials. And they also created several training programs to further bolster Ukraine's capabilities. So having gone through those significant changes over the last 3 years, and then not only was Ukraine no longer front and center at the 2025 summit, but the NATO Ukraine Council, which in the last 2 years had a significant role during the summit, it was downgraded to a working dinner that some members within the alliance didn't even attend. And to that point as well, individuals such as Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, when he was meeting with journalists during the NATO summit, he specifically stated that NATO has no place in Ukraine. And in addition, when defense ministers met in February of this calendar year, Secretary of Defense within the United States, Pete Hegseth, also stated that Ukraine doesn't have a place in NATO currently. And Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as President Trump, have made those points too, that Ukraine should not have part of NATO. And that was actually also covered extensively when the initial peace talks between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine began in Saudi Arabia in February of this year, where they were saying that one of the things that Ukraine would have to give up in terms of trying to achieve a ceasefire is aspirations toward NATO. So it's a very different shift But I think while the United States and Hungary have openly said that Ukraine should not be part of NATO at this time, numerous other countries within the organization, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Scandinavian countries, Czechia, and some others are very supportive of Ukraine. And I think not only because of Ukraine's interaction with NATO since 2014, when the first Russian invasion began, and Ukraine was doing a lot of training exercises with NATO, but they've also realized that Ukraine, many organizations and news outlets and governments did not give it a chance when the full-scale invasion began in 2022. And now the war is in 3.5 years, and the Ukrainians have clearly shown that they are capable and able to defend themselves by using not only Western weapons, but their strategies, because Russia is significantly larger in terms of financial capability, defense capability, the population in terms of soldiers, and the Ukrainians are still holding their own. And I think that a lot of members within NATO are realizing the abilities, not only through defense, but because of Ukraine's experience with cyber warfare and defending themselves against Russian attacks, that this would be an additional inclusion and an important part of the alliance. And President Zelensky did have an opportunity to speak with President Trump as well as the Secretary General from NATO and a few other individuals. And of course, NATO made the usual comments about how the alliance will continue providing assistance to Ukraine and condemning Russian aggression, but it was not really anywhere stated in the final declaration after the summit.
That's interesting. Of course, these declarations tend to be pre-agreed in advance rather than hammered out on the day. So one wonders what European allies might have tried to get into the draft, but wasn't able to do so. Is there also a recognition in NATO that the intent may be there and the funding is starting to align towards rearmament? But actually, many allies, including Britain, quite disappointingly, pushed for the timelines to be really quite elongated. Is there a self-awareness that despite going in the right direction, it will take considerable amount of time for this rearmament to actually kick in, for the procurement, the manufacturing, and so on? Is there even an awareness that these kind of elongated procurement processes and timelines may mean that whatever's being commissioned may be partially redundant by the time it actually gets delivered? Or is NATO still working like a sort of, a bureaucratic super tanker, almost impossible to kind of turn it around at speed, and including many of the larger allies like Britain, France, Germany, US?
France is one of the countries, as well as Slovakia and the United Kingdom, that were saying that while they were supportive of the increase from 2% GDP threshold to 5%, they're concerned that they will not be able to meet that target within 10 years. And what's also interesting is the understanding of defense capability and strategies differs across the organization. So, for example, with countries that are closer to Russia's border because they're observing what Russia's doing in Ukraine, they are more concerned and they are more forceful with the desire and goal to reach those national strategy targets, the defense spending target, and those, of course, are the Baltics and Poland. But when people move further west geographically, a lot of those countries are responding slower. And I think that while there is an understanding and most countries are supportive that they need to invest more in their national defense, there are significant concerns about how do those countries agree and reach those points, because the governments need to make difficult decisions. It's not like the parliamentary bodies within these countries can just magically decide, okay, by such and such year, we're going to reach 5% because we're at this percent now. They have to make decisions on how to restructure the budget to get to that point. Does that also mean that other programs and initiatives within those countries are going to be cut, such as humanitarian aid or diplomatic organizations or things happening within their own countries with social services? These are things that have not really been discussed, but they're very, very significant points because the money has to be allocated to reach those targets. It's not like the number can just be invented and magically they'll reach those targets. And I think as time progresses, because there have been a lot of slowing down in procurement chain and the need to modernize weapon manufacturing systems and these facilities that create the weapons, something that was especially apparent during COVID when supply chains across the world were slowed down. It is certainly possible that without further communication and the discussion on how to best do the reforming of the defense industrial base, this could lead to a lot of redundancies in defense capabilities and things needed. And I think in some capacity, while it's important to address the need for national security, I think there's too much emphasis on this goal of reaching that 5% threshold. It's simply for perhaps it's seen as just ticking off a box and say, yes, we completed this objective. But what does that actually mean to get to that point?
If we have a breakdown, including a breakdown of the UK recent sort of defense review, it does say there are a couple of things flagged up there. One, of course, is the erosion of the industrial base that actually becomes strategically really important in order to get this rearmament process going. And there's a whole bunch of strategic heavy industries that are foundational, which may need to be invested in, not just the end product like sort of ammunition and so on, but also the UK defence review seemed to put huge emphasis on nuclear deterrent. But if anything, the war in Ukraine shows that you can have a huge sort of kinetic sort of aggression, um, and it doesn't necessarily trigger a nuclear response. So are we actually putting vast amounts of money into something that is not going to prevent not just the war in Ukraine, it's too late for that, but not really deter Russia from other forms of sub-nuclear kinetic aggression in, say, the Baltics or against Poland or against another NATO member?
And that was an important point that was discussed during the summit because Article 5 within the NATO organization says that, to paraphrase, an attack on one member state is an attack on all. And the only instance where that has been the case was when the September 11th attacks in 2001 occurred within the United States, where NATO members came together to provide aid to the United States during, and then what eventually led to the war on terrorism. There's now a large concern that because of comments made by the current US administration, if a country such as Estonia, which is on the border of Russia, was attacked, not through nuclear means, but the kinetic events, as you were stating, that there may not be a desire or there may not be motivation to go protect those countries. So that was another point of the declaration, which was to reinstate the importance of Article 5 and how the collective is strong. And the emphasis on nuclear deterrence is also interesting because Russia, throughout the last 3.5 years, has stated that if the war escalates on the Ukrainian side, they will use nuclear weapons and saber-rattling. And I think something that's very unfortunate is many individuals around the world. Of course, they have access to classified information and top secret materials that individuals such as ourselves will not be able to access because they have an understanding of certain things going on that we can't simply know or see. There has been no indication that the Russians would use nuclear weapons. Initially it was don't send HIMARS or different types of missile systems or equipment to Ukraine, and then they received them. And then it was don't send the F-16s, which Ukraine finally received last year. And I think something that's very unfortunate for the Ukrainians is it's as if they've had to unlock assistance from the Western community to continue proving to those that Russia is just saber rattling with nuclear abilities, that they are not going to use nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians as the Ukrainians continue to defend themselves and fight against that. And there's also a discussion about what does nuclear deterrent mean. Some believe that by providing nuclear capabilities to more countries, that ensures that they are not going to be used. But I'm more of the opinion if more individuals have the capabilities for nuclear abilities, that can lead to more further instability and violence across the world.
And another topic, and this is actually a significant one, especially in the light of what happened subsequent to the so-called NATO consensus. Trump pulled out, or rather his proxy Hegseth, um, ceased the supply of munitions that had already been mandated and approved by the Biden administration. That's an extraordinary move to handicap a key Western ally. In the NATO summit itself, though, was the risks of an ammunition famine discussed? Was the risks of Ukraine not having an endless supply of people to train for its army? Were these kind of limitations or crunch issues discussed at all? And were any remedies put forward?
I think one way to address further assistance to Ukraine was that point about allowing aid to Ukraine to count towards that defense threshold, the 5% that NATO members established. So while it does not specifically outright say that the alliance will continue providing aid to Ukraine. It is tying future assistance to Ukraine through defense capabilities within those countries as well. They also, NATO members stated that they would pledge collectively 50 billion euros in defense assistance to Ukraine. I think that they've reached about 35 billion to date of this calendar year. So there has been that progress, although a lot of that has been provided on the earlier half of this year. And I was not invited to those conversations, so I'm not entirely sure what was discussed within the NATO Council with relations to Ukraine. But I think, unfortunately, in Ukraine's case, a large portion of this NATO summit was the Trump show to ensure that the president of the United States was on board with the alliance and to ensure that the United States will remain part of the alliance. And unfortunately, because Ukraine is not part of NATO, that was one of the sacrifices that the alliance needed to make in order to have the United States more involved and on board on its current abilities.
And indeed, Ukraine seems to have given something of a warning during the summit that actually the window of the opportunity for it to defend its full territory is shrinking. We're now into summer. There is evidence that Russia is again trying to mount a summer offensive. Um, it may well not succeed, even if they do have, large numbers of additional sort of bodies to throw at the problem, simply because they haven't changed their techniques radically enough in order for those to succeed. But was Ukraine able to really get across the sort of urgency of the situation? Um, or do we still feel that the West is very much on a kind of autopilot, assuming in some ways that Ukraine can keep fighting for year after year after year?
I think some countries within the alliance do understand that there are instances where Sweden or Estonia or Latvia or other countries that are closer to proximity to Russia have established their own abilities to provide assistance to Ukraine. So not only is it that NATO collectively is sending aid, but these countries have specifically announced declarations that they have provided, 100 million or $1 billion in defense assistance to Ukraine. So countries in some cases have taken it in their own authority to provide assistance rather than relying on the Western collective to move together in these abilities. And Ukrainians to date, they understand the significance that if the war ends on Russia's terms, then Ukraine will not exist anymore as a country. But if Russia ends the war, then Ukraine continues. So the Ukrainians who have been fighting for independence, not just against the Russians or the Soviets, but several others in the region for over 400 years, they understand the importance of independence. They want to be part of the West. They want to be involved, and they will continue to fight for their survival because they understand that it's either the country will exist or not. And I think that 3.5 years in now, a lot of world leaders and policymakers should understand what is occurring, but there is a sense of an autopilot that the Ukrainians have done very well to defend themselves. They've reclaimed some territory. The country, which does not have a navy, was able to destroy about a third to a half of Russia's naval fleet in the Black Sea, and they've managed to repurpose drones and other missile abilities to ensure that they are destroying Russian ammunition depots and energy abilities or weapons factories that are providing aid to the Russians to continue launching this war. But there's not that extra push that the Ukrainians need the abilities to win this war. And that was one of the big disservices that as the war continued, if the Ukrainians had received weaponry sooner, they could have attacked a lot of these areas that are providing assistance to the Russians near the Ukrainian border. And after the West finally announced at the end of 2024 that the Ukrainians would have these abilities, the Russians then moved away a lot of these ammo depots and abilities that were sending aid. So that was an opportunity missed. And it seems as while the West continues to go on this autopilot, similar events will occur, and that will only result in additional Ukrainian lives lost, both servicemen and women, as well as civilians who are being targeted by Russia's aggression.
Well, let's sort of wrap up with a sort of two double-barrel question, fairly big one. One is to give a summary of what was really decided of significance and what significant topics were really avoided or ducked. The other one, of course, is it's been feared since Trump came back in, and indeed there have been some announcements about this, which were then not necessarily acted upon, that Trump might seek a withdrawal of US forces from Europe entirely, although he did hint that he keeps some in Hungary. Hungary, perhaps the territory that is least at risk of a Russian invasion, because the perception there is that they already have a Putin puppet who's entirely compliant. Well, of course, if Orban leaves power, that dynamic might change and it may become a target of Russia again. But with those two questions, what was decided, what was not decided, and is it still a threat that the US withdraws from Europe?
I think in this current state, and of course things can always change in the future, but in this current state, NATO received a victory because the United States is still on board, and the United States received its goal of the 5% GDP increase and the need for the industrial base to be addressed and for European members in NATO to increase their defense capabilities. In addition, there was the discussion that the Article 5 portion of NATO is still significant. So while, again, no one knows what the future has and things can always change, at this current state, those were two victories for the alliance. A smaller victory for Ukraine is that while specific mentions or condemnations of Russia's ongoing war were not stated, the members within the alliance did state that providing assistance to Ukraine does count towards the 5% GDP threshold. So providing future assistance to Ukraine is both a win for Ukraine because it receives that assistance to continue protecting itself. It also is a victory for the NATO members because they're helping strengthen their collective security and ability. Afterwards, there was not much else discussed in terms of what does a national security mean for the European continent? How can the countries within NATO work together? How can they ensure not just against Russian aggression, but what does it mean against Chinese aggression or cybersecurity attacks? Not by either of those countries, but just in general. And there were other discussions that were missed. With the industrial base point, I think it's interesting that not only did NATO say it has to address the industrial base within its 32 members, it is also open to working on improving defense capabilities with the European Union as well as Ukraine. So I think from that capacity, they're understanding that by more countries being involved, it will create a larger security collective. But from Ukraine's perspective, there were a lot of misses because there were not further statements against Russian aggression. There were no discussions about, yes, Ukraine will become part of NATO at some point in time, but what does that mean and what does it need to achieve to get to that point? Because there are several traditional members, or even you might say dovish members of NATO, who would say that Ukraine can't join because of the ongoing war that Russia started. In addition, there were not many discussions on how can they provide additional assistance to Ukraine, and they the NATO members are still not able to provide a definitive answer on, yes, they will continue to stand with Ukraine. Yes, they will continue to provide assistance to Ukraine, but are they sending just enough equipment to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, or will they do that extra step forward to provide Ukraine with the assistance it needs to win this war? And the fact that they did not specifically say in terms of Ukrainian victory in the final declaration is important. But I think from NATO's perspective, a lot of members will think that this was a victory simply because of the significance. If the United States was to withdraw, how would that point be filled? And for now, it seems like that will not occur.
Well, Mark, it's both fascinating and I think important to catch up. You keep an extremely close eye on all of the conversations, debates, as well as the official statements that are released from NATO. Um, and whereas Ukraine didn't get everything that it really needed and wanted out of this, the worst case scenario wasn't, met either. So that there's something to be positive. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the channel and discussing these issues once again. I know the audience found last year's episode absolutely fascinating. I hope they find this just as useful.
Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to talking to you about the summit next year.